A foul stench. A locked house. A gruesome discovery. When police entered 12205 Imperial Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio, in October 2009, they had no idea they were about to uncover one of the most horrifying serial murder cases in history. The man inside? A seemingly ordinary neighbor. The reality? A monster hiding in plain sight. What they found inside would haunt them forever. Before we begin, welcome to True Crime Vault, your go-to source for captivating crime stories, unsolved mysteries, and gripping investigations. A huge thank you to my amazing viewers and subscribers for your support. Keep tuning in for daily updates on true crime tales, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated. Cleveland, Ohio, 2009. The sky hung heavy with dark gray clouds, casting an eerie gloom over Mount Pleasant, a neighborhood where poverty wasn't just visible, it was inescapable. Boarded-up houses, cracked sidewalks, trash-strewn alleys, the kind of place the rest of the city tried to forget. But something else haunted these streets. Something worse than the crime, the abandoned buildings, or the sense of hopelessness that lingered in the air. It was a smell, one that settled over the neighborhood like a sickness. It clung to clothes, seeped into homes, and turned stomachs. At first, people assumed it was a dead animal rotting in the summer heat. Maybe garbage left to fester in the alleyways, or sewage backing up somewhere in the old, neglected pipes. But weeks passed, then months, and the stench only grew stronger. It was unlike anything they had ever smelled before, thick, cloying, unnatural, a scent that triggered something primal, something deep within the human brain that whispered, danger. People did what they could to block it out. They shut their windows, sprayed air fresheners, lit candles. Some even stuffed towels under their doors, desperate to keep it out. But nothing worked. Still, no one questioned it too much. No one knocked on the door of 12205 Imperial Avenue to ask why. Because in Mount Pleasant, people knew better than to pry into their neighbor's business. Curiosity could get you killed. So, they ignored it. And that's exactly what Anthony Sowell was counting on. October 29th, 2009. A woman stumbled into the Cleveland Police Department, breathless, her entire body trembling. Her face was swollen, fresh bruises blooming along her neck like dark fingerprints. Her hands shook as she clutched her torn clothing, gasping for air, barely able to get the words out. She had just escaped from 12205 Imperial Avenue, and she knew if she hadn't, she'd be dead. The officers inside barely had time to react before she collapsed into a chair, sobbing. They offered her water, tried to calm her down. But there was no calming down after what she had just been through. Between panicked breaths, she told him about the man who had nearly ended her life. Anthony Sowell, the quiet man who lived on the corner. A man nobody thought twice about. But behind his locked doors, he was a monster, and she was his latest victim. She told him how he lured her in with a simple offer, a drink, some company, a moment to escape the cold. It seemed harmless enough. But as soon as she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The air was heavy, thick with an unbearable stench. Something in his eyes, cold, hollow, sent a shiver through her spine. And then, before she could react, his hands were around her throat. She fought. She clawed at his face, thrashed against his grip, but his strength was overwhelming. The room darkened as her vision blurred. She was suffocating, fading. But just as she was slipping away, he loosened his grip. Just for a second, just long enough for her to act. She mustered everything she had left, driving her knee into his stomach, elbowing him hard in the ribs. He stumbled, caught off guard, and she ran, out the door, down the street. She didn't stop running, not until she reached the police station. Her words spilled out in frantic bursts, pleading with the officers. This wasn't just an attack. This was something much worse. She wasn't the first woman to go inside that house, but she was one of the only ones to come out. The police exchanged glances. They had heard about missing women before. They had received complaints about a foul smell coming from Sowell's home. But until now, nothing had been done. Now, they had no choice. This time, they listened. Within minutes, sirens filled the night. Red and blue lights cut through the darkness as patrol cars raced toward Imperial Avenue. The streets were slick with recent rain, the pavement glistening under the flashing lights. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as a police convoy came to a stop in front of a decaying two-story house. It looked abandoned. The paint was peeling. The windows were covered with thick, dark curtains. Trash littered the yard, old beer cans, broken furniture, piles of scrap metal. And that smell, it hit them the moment they stepped out of their cars. The officers hesitated, hands hovering over their holsters. Something about this place felt wrong. The air itself seemed heavier, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for them to come inside. A young officer, just 3 years into the force, stepped forward and knocked on the door. No response. He knocked again, harder this time. Silence. Then, with a nod from the lead detective, the battering ram came out. The first strike splintered the wood. The second caved it in. The door swung open with a groan, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The officers stepped inside, and they weren't prepared for what lay within. The first officer stepped in and immediately staggered back, gagging. The air inside the house was thick, heavy, suffocating. It wrapped around him like a blanket of decay, seeping into his lungs, into his skin. The smell was overpowering, unlike anything he had ever encountered before. It was the unmistakable stench of death. He covered his nose and pushed forward, his boots crunching against something on the floor. Trash was scattered everywhere, empty beer cans, cigarette butts, piles of dirty clothes. The house was in complete disarray, a chaotic mess of filth and neglect. But none of that mattered, not compared to what they were about to find. A second officer stepped into the living room, sweeping his flashlight across the darkened space. The beam flickered over torn furniture, stained carpets, and a small table covered in liquor bottles. But then, something else caught his eye. A large black garbage bag, bulging unnaturally, tied shut in the corner of the room. His heart pounded. He took a step closer. The smell grew even stronger. With gloved hands, he reached out and gently pressed on the bag. It was soft, too soft. He hesitated, then slowly peeled the plastic apart, just enough to see what was inside. A wave of nausea hit him instantly. Inside the bag, a rotting human limb. He recoiled, stumbling backward. His hand flew to his radio. "We need backup. Now!" But this was just the beginning. Another officer moved toward the kitchen. More garbage bags lined the floor, some twitching with movement. Flies, hundreds of them. He turned toward the sink, where dainty dishes were piled high, swarming with insects. The smell of spoiled food mixed with the overwhelming stench of decomposition, making his stomach churn. Then he noticed the basement door. It was slightly ajar. He reached for the handle, and the moment he pulled it open, a swarm of thick black flies erupted from the darkness, buzzing furiously, crashing into his face. He staggered backward, coughing violently, choking on the putrid air. Another officer stepped forward, shining his flashlight down the basement steps. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing piles of black garbage bags, stacked haphazardly on top of one another. Some had been chewed open by rats, revealing patches of decayed flesh inside. The silence in the room grew deafening. Then, from upstairs, a voice shouted, "We've got bodies, multiple bodies." The officers rushed toward the bedroom, their boots thudding against the creaking floorboards. The moment they stepped inside, the sight before them froze them in place. On the floor, a woman's decomposing body lay sprawled out, her arms twisted unnaturally, her face frozen in a permanent scream. Her skin had darkened, her body bloated with decay. Flies swarmed her open mouth, crawling over her lifeless eyes. But she wasn't alone. Under the mattress, another body, barely recognizable, tightly wrapped in plastic. In the corner of the room, a third corpse, slumped over, covered in maggots. The room was a tomb. One officer turned away, dry heaving. Another grabbed his radio. "We need the coroner. We need forensic units. We need everyone. Now!" Outside, Sirens blared as more officers arrived, setting up crime scene tape around the house. Neighbors gathered, whispering, watching in horror as a nightmare inside 12205 Imperial Avenue unfolded before their eyes. More bags were discovered, more bodies, one after another, carried out in black body bags, lined up along the sidewalk like a grim assembly line of death. What police uncovered inside Anthony Sowell's house would go down as one of the most horrifying discoveries in Cleveland's history. This was not just a crime scene. This was a graveyard. But there was one problem. Anthony Sowell was nowhere to be found. The House of Horrors had been exposed. The truth was out. But the man responsible for it all, the man who had lured, tortured, and murdered so many women, had vanished. The moment police stepped into 12205 Imperial Avenue and saw the nightmare inside, an urgent APB was issued for Anthony Sowell. Patrol cars flooded the streets. Helicopters circled overhead. Officers spread out across Cleveland, searching every alley, every abandoned building, every place he could be hiding. But he was gone. Detectives immediately began piecing together his last known movements. Witnesses reported seeing him just days earlier, casually walking the neighborhood as if nothing had happened. Neighbors who had long suspected something was off about him now watched in shock as news stations plastered his face across every screen. The city of Cleveland was on edge. Fear rippled through the streets. Women locked their doors, afraid to step outside. Every shadow, every passing stranger carried a potential of danger, because out there, somewhere, Anthony Sowell was lurking. For 3 days, he was the most wanted man in America. His name dominated the headlines. His mugshot flooded TV screens and newspapers. Billboards flashed warnings. Have you seen this man? A citywide manhunt is now underway for 50-year-old Anthony Sowell, suspected in the murders of multiple women in Cleveland. Authorities are urging residents to stay alert and report any sightings immediately. Leads poured in. Some swore they saw him at a bus stop. Others claimed he was hiding in abandoned buildings. But every search turned up empty. Sowell, a man with military training and a lifetime of evading consequences, had disappeared into the very city he once hunted in. Then came Halloween night, October 31st, 2009. A bar employee in downtown Cleveland was wiping down tables when he spotted a man outside, lingering near the entrance. He looked dirty, disheveled, nervous. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to be chasing him. But it was his face, the unmistakable face from the news, that made the bartender's blood run cold. Anthony Sowell. Heart pounding, he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. I think I just saw that guy. The serial killer. The one on the news. Within minutes, law enforcement swarmed the area. Armed officers moved in silently, blocking every possible escape route. The city had been holding its breath for 3 days. Now, it was about to end. Sowell was walking aimlessly, eyes darting from left to right. He was tired. He had nowhere left to run. And then, flashing lights, sirens, the sound of footsteps rushing toward him. He barely had time to react before he was surrounded. Officers ordered him to the ground. He hesitated for a split second, as if considering whether to fight or flee. But there was no escape now. Within seconds, he was tackled, pinned to the pavement, his arms wrenched behind his back. As they hauled him to his feet, the crowd around them erupted. Bystanders whispered in disbelief. Some shouted at him. Others stood frozen, staring at the man who had been living among them all this time, a predator hiding in plain sight. For the first time, Anthony Sowell was no longer in control. 15 minutes after the call was made, the man responsible for one of the most chilling murder sprees in Ohio's history was finally in custody. Anthony Sowell stood in the courtroom, his face blank, his eyes scanning the room as if none of this mattered. But to the families of his victims, this moment meant everything. They had waited for justice, some for years, and now they were finally about to see it served. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the charges. 82 counts. Murder, kidnapping, abuse of corpses. The list went on. Each word landed like a hammer, but Sowell remained emotionless, as if the lives he had taken were nothing more than forgotten memories. For weeks, the trial dragged on. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man who had hunted his victims, who had preyed on the vulnerable, the overlooked, the women society had abandoned. One by one, the families took the stand. They spoke of mothers, daughters, sisters, women who had dreams, who had lives that were stolen away. Some cried, others seethed with rage. But through it all, Sowell sat there, unmoved, his face unreadable. Then the verdict. Guilty, on all counts. A ripple of emotion spread through the room. Some wept with relief. Others clenched their fists, knowing that no punishment could ever undo what he had done. The judge wasted no time delivering his sentence. Death! Anthony Sowell was to be executed by lethal injection. But for the families, justice still felt incomplete. Their daughters were never coming home. Their pain would never fade. And Sowell, cowardly as ever, would find ways to delay his fate. Years of appeals followed. Sowell's lawyers fought to overturn the sentence, citing everything from ineffective counsel to supposed mental illness. But each appeal failed. The clock was running out. Then, in February 2021, fate intervened. Anthony Sowell was found unresponsive in his prison cell. Cancer had done what the justice system hadn't. He was dead. There was no execution, no final moment of reckoning. He passed away quietly, painlessly, nothing like the deaths he had inflicted upon his victims. Some called it unfair. Others saw it as fitting. In the end, the monster of Imperial Avenue died the way he had lived, without remorse. In 2011, the city of Cleveland took one final step in erasing the horrors of Sowell's crimes. 12205 Imperial Avenue, the house where so many suffered, was torn to the ground. The demolition drew a crowd. Neighbors, reporters, even family members of the victims stood in silence as the walls collapsed, as dust filled the air, as the last remnants of that nightmare were wiped away. But tearing down a house doesn't erase the past. It doesn't bring back the women who were lost. The women Anthony Sowell killed were forgotten by society until it was too late. They were overlooked, ignored, dismissed. And that is the real tragedy. Because for every victim whose name we now remember, how many more are still missing? How many others have been abandoned, waiting for justice that may never come? If you found this case chilling, don't forget to like and subscribe. And remember, some nightmares are real.